You dropped it." I didn't even need to look up to know it wasn't one of the other security guards speaking. The voice was different, too low, too controlled. The kind of voice that doesn't need to repeat itself, because whoever hears it understands, instinctively, that there won't be a second chance. I looked down at the marble floor. The small silver polish bottle was there, a few inches away from my knee, where it had slipped from my fingers when I turned too quickly. A silly mistake. The kind of thing that happens when you're trying to finish the job before the employer leaves his office and crosses the hallway. But I had miscalculated, and now he was standing less than 6 feet away from me, looking at the bottle on the floor, and I was kneeling in the middle of the main corridor of the mansion with nowhere to go. "Sorry," I said. The word came out small, barely audible. I picked up the bottle and stood up slowly, without making any sudden movements. It was an unwritten rule in that house. Nothing sudden. Nothing loud. Nothing that drew unnecessary attention. Hakjin hadn't established that rule verbally, at least not with me, but 3 weeks of working there was enough to understand that the entire environment adjusted to his rhythm, and his rhythm did not tolerate chaos. He kept walking. He said nothing more. He didn't wait for my full response, didn't check if I was okay, didn't smile. He simply passed by, the dark suit moving with that strange precision I still hadn't been able to name, and disappeared through the door on the right, where the private office was. 2 men followed him in silence, as always, making no eye contact with anyone. I stood still for a few seconds longer than I should have. My supervisor, Donna, appeared around the corner of the hallway with a microfiber cloth in her hand, and that expression she reserved for when I did something that could have been avoided. She was a woman in her mid-50s, gray hair always pinned behind her head, efficient in the way only people with decades of practice can be. Isabella. She didn't need to say anything more. "I know," I replied, already turning back to the side table I had been polishing. "You know, but you're not paying attention." She stopped beside me, but she wasn't exactly scolding me. There was something closer to a warning in her tone. In this house, paying attention is not optional. I wanted to say that I was paying attention, that I knew exactly what I was doing, that the bottle had slipped because the surface of my glove was damp, not because my mind had been somewhere else. But that would have been a lie. My mind had been somewhere else. It had been in Chicago, specifically in the small apartment I had left behind 8 months ago, when the deal with the employment agency had fallen through, when my cousin had called me saying there was an opening in New York, live-in work, accommodation included, good salary, and that I shouldn't ask too many questions about who the employer was because jobs like that didn't come around twice. I had accepted without asking enough. That was the central problem of the entire situation I found myself in. Donna left without waiting for my answer. I finished polishing the table in silence. The mansion was located in a neighborhood in Westchester County, New York, the kind of place where houses hide behind walls and hedgerows, and where neighbors don't make eye contact when they pass each other on the private road. It was a 3-story building, discreet by neighborhood standards, but inside it was something else entirely. High ceilings, dark wood furniture, lighting designed to create shadow rather than eliminate it. There was an artificial stillness about the place, as if the silence had been built into the walls along with the plaster. I slept in a small room on the 3rd floor, along with 3 other live-in staff members. My shift started at 6 in the morning and ended at 6 in the evening, 6 days a week. The 7th day was theoretically mine, but there was little to do with it when you lived inside the job and the city was 40 minutes away by bus. What I had come to understand about Hakjin in those first weeks was this. He rarely appeared before noon. When he did, there were always at least 2 people in his shadow, never fewer. He spoke little. He didn't shout. He didn't throw things. He didn't humiliate staff members in front of others. That had surprised me, honestly, because I had expected something different after my cousin had explained to me, in whispers during a quick phone call. that the man I was going to work for had certain connections that were not exactly legal. "You don't need to know the details," she had said. "Just do the work and stay quiet." I had stayed quiet. It was what I did best. But that Tuesday, something changed. It was close to 4 p.m. when I was sent to bring a tray with tea to the office. Donna had called me into the kitchen with a direct look and said, "Mr. Hakjin asked for tea. Your closest." I wasn't the staff member who normally attended the office. There was an unofficial hierarchy in the live-in service, and I was still too new to be on the list of those who had regular access to that hallway. But apparently whoever was on the list had left early, and I was what was available. I took the tray. I set the teapot, the cup, the small spoon, a little saucer with brown sugar, because Donna told me that was how he preferred it, and walked to the office door. I knocked twice, softly. "Come in." I opened the door with my shoulder, holding the tray with both hands, and stepped inside. The office was larger than I had imagined, an entire wall of shelves with books and some files, a wide central desk made of dark oak, with an open laptop and several papers organized in stacks that seemed to have their own logic, one that only he understood. There were 2 dark leather armchairs on the opposite side of the desk, and at the windows, heavy curtains drawn halfway, letting in only a strip of afternoon light. Hakjin was sitting behind the desk. He wasn't looking at the computer. He was looking at me. I walked closer, set the tray on the clear side of the desk he had left open, and stepped back 1 pace. "Isabella," he said. I stopped. It wasn't a question. It was my name, spoken with that precision he placed in everything, as if each syllable had been weighed before being released. I hadn't known he knew my name. I was new. There were at least 12 people working there full-time. "Yes, sir," I said. He looked at me for a moment. It wasn't an invasive look, exactly. It was more like the look of someone verifying something they already knew, but wanted to confirm. "You may go," he said finally. I went. But when I reached the hallway and the door closed behind me, I realized my breathing was slightly short, as if I had forgotten to breathe normally the entire time I had been inside that room, and only now was my body compensating. I leaned against the cold wall of the corridor for just a second. He knew my name. That small, specific piece of information sat in the center of my chest for the rest of the afternoon. Strange and uncomfortable, like a grain of sand inside a shoe that you can't remove without completely stopping whatever you're doing. That evening, after dinner was served and the kitchens were cleaned, I went up to the 3rd floor earlier than usual. My roommates were still downstairs, and the hallway was silent. I went to the small window in our room that faced the side garden and stood there looking out for no particular reason. There were 2 black cars parked at the side entrance that I hadn't seen before. A man in a suit was standing near the first car, looking at his phone. Another was standing near the gate, completely still. A visit, or business. I knew the difference. 3 weeks had been enough time for that. I stepped away from the window and sat on the edge of my bed. I took off my shoes and stared at my socks for a moment, thinking about Chicago, about the small apartment, about the laundry job that had closed, about the stack of bills I was paying with the salary wired to my account on the 1st of every month. I had come here out of necessity. I had stayed out of necessity, and I would remain here out of necessity, at least for a few more months, until I had enough money to start over somewhere with more options. That was the logic. It was a good logic. It was a logic that worked very well as long as I wasn't thinking about the way he had said my name, calm and direct, as if he had known for some time that there would be a moment when he would need to use it. The next morning started the same way every morning started in that house, with the sound of the side door being unlocked at 5:55, the low hum of the kitchen ventilation system coming to life, and the smell of coffee that Donna always had ready before any of us officially started our shift. I came downstairs with my hair pulled back and my uniform pressed, the same as always, and took my assignment sheet from the small board by the kitchen entrance. 3rd floor hallway, main staircase banister, east wing sitting room, routine work. The kind that lets your hands move on their own while your mind drifts somewhere else entirely, which was both a comfort and a problem, depending on what your mind decided to drift toward. I started with the banister because it was the longest task, and I preferred to get the difficult things done first. The wood was dark and ornate, carved with a detail that someone had clearly put real thought into decades ago, and it required a specific motion. Long, even strokes, no pressure on the joints, or you'd leave streaks. I had learned that the hard way in my first week, when Donna had come behind me and redone an entire section without saying a single word, which was somehow worse than being told directly. I was about halfway down the second floor when I heard voices coming from below. Not the usual low exchanges between staff. These were different. Sharper. Two men speaking in Korean, quickly. The words overlapping in a way that didn't sound like a casual conversation. I couldn't understand the language, but I didn't need to. The tone carried enough. I kept working. Eyes on the wood, hands moving. One of the voices got louder for just a moment. Not quite a shout, but close. And then cut off completely. The silence that followed was the kind that feels heavier than sound. I heard footsteps cross the entrance hall below, then a door closing firmly. Not slammed, just closed with more intention than necessary. Then nothing. I exhaled slowly and moved my cloth to the next section of the banister. 30 seconds later, Hakjin appeared at the bottom of the staircase. He didn't look up immediately. He was adjusting the cuff of his jacket with 2 fingers, the motion precise and unhurried, as if whatever had just happened in that room had already been filed away somewhere internal and dealt with. Then he looked up and saw me on the stairs above him. I froze for half a second before I could stop myself. He didn't react to my freezing. He just looked at me the same way he had the day before in the corridor, that steady, measuring look, and then started up the stairs. I moved to the far side to give him room to pass. He walked past me without a word, close enough that I could see the faint tension in his jaw, the only visible sign that something in the last few minutes hadn't gone exactly the way he intended. He was gone around the upper landing before I remembered to start breathing again. That afternoon, everything shifted. I was in the East Wing sitting room, dusting the shelves along the far wall, when Marcus came in. Marcus was one of the senior security staff, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s who spoke with a quiet authority that made clear he had been in that position for a long time. He was one of the few people in the house who ever spoke to the domestic staff directly, and even then it was always brief and to the point. "Donna needs you downstairs," he said from the doorway. I set the cloth down and followed him. Donna was in the small room off the kitchen that served as her office, a narrow space with a desk, 2 chairs, and a whiteboard on the wall covered in shift schedules. She was standing when I came in, which meant this wasn't a routine conversation. "Close the door," she said. I did. "There's going to be a private event here on Friday evening," she said. "Dinner for 12. External guests. The house will need to be at a different standard than usual, and I need people I trust for the evening service." She looked at me steadily. "I'm putting you on the dining room." I waited to see if there was more. "You'll need to be invisible," she continued. "Plates move, glasses are refilled. Nothing is left on the table longer than it should be. You don't speak unless spoken to, and if someone does speak to you, you answer briefly and move on. Do you understand?" "Yes," I said. "These are not ordinary guests, Isabella." "I understand." She looked at me for a moment longer, as if she was measuring something that wasn't visible on the surface. Then she nodded once and turned back to her desk. I took that as my cue to leave. I stepped back into the kitchen and stood near the counter for a moment, my hand resting on the cool edge of the marble. Not ordinary guests. In that house, I had already gathered that not ordinary could mean a great many things. Some of them were things I preferred not to think about too directly. Friday came with a gray sky and a wind that rattled the tall windows in the East Wing. By 3 in the afternoon, the house had shifted into a different mode entirely. A florist arrived with arrangements that were loaded onto a dolly and wheeled through the service entrance. 2 extra kitchen staff came in. People I hadn't seen before, efficient and silent, who moved around our regular team without introduction. The dining table, which I had helped extend that morning with 2 extra leaves, was being set by the time I finished changing into the formal version of the uniform. Black instead of the usual gray. White cuffs, everything pressed twice. The guests arrived at 7. I was in position near the sideboard, slightly behind the line of sight from the main seating area, when I heard the front entrance open. The sound of several pairs of shoes crossing the marble floor. Low voices. Then the doors of the dining room opened, and people began to enter, guided by Marcus and another member of the security team. I kept my eyes on the table, on the glasses, on the arrangement of silverware. But I noticed when Hakjin entered. It wasn't something I decided to notice. It was more that the room changed when he walked in. A subtle shift in how everyone else in it held themselves. The guests, men and women in expensive, understated clothing, arranged themselves around the table with the practiced ease of people who attended events like this regularly. But there was a particular awareness in the room when Hakjin took his seat at the center of the long side of the table. Not at the head. The center. From there he could see everyone, and everyone could feel that they were seen. Service began. I moved through the room with the careful efficiency Donna had trained into me over the past weeks. Dishes arrived from the kitchen, were placed, collected. Glasses were checked and quietly refilled when they reached a certain level. I worked without sound, without making eye contact with guests unless they looked at me directly, which most of them didn't. Most of them. About 40 minutes into the dinner, one of the men seated near the end of the table said something to me in a low voice as I reached past him to remove a plate. I didn't catch it clearly at first. The table conversation was ongoing, and there was music playing softly from somewhere. So I leaned the smallest amount closer and said quietly, "I'm sorry?" He said it again. It was a question about whether there was a particular wine available, phrased in a way that was almost polite, but carried a tone underneath that was something else. "I'll check with the kitchen," I said, and straightened, already turning toward the service door. I didn't see it happen. I only heard it, or rather felt it. A change in the tone of the room so sudden and complete that my hand stopped on the door handle before I had consciously decided to stop. I turned my head slightly without fully turning around. Hakjin was looking at the man who had spoken to me. He wasn't saying anything. He was simply looking at him, his expression unchanged from what it had been all evening. Composed, attentive, unreadable. But something in the quality of that look made the man shift in his seat and reach for his water glass, and the small smile he had been wearing when he spoke to me was gone. The table conversation resumed within seconds, seamlessly, as if nothing had interrupted it. I went through the service door. On the other side, I stood in the narrow corridor between the dining room and the kitchen and let out a breath that felt like it had been held for considerably longer than the last 30 seconds. My pulse was unsteady in a way that confused me, because nothing had happened. Nothing had been said. No one had raised a voice or made a scene. And yet, I went to find Donna and ask her about the wine. And the whole time I was walking down that corridor, I could not stop thinking about the way a single look from across a dinner table had been enough to make a grown man in an expensive suit quietly put down whatever he had been thinking about doing. Saturday morning arrived quietly, the way mornings do after something has shifted without anyone officially acknowledging it. The guests were gone by midnight. The dining room had been reset. The extra kitchen staff had left, and the house had folded itself back into its usual stillness like nothing had happened. But something had, and I felt it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. Not in any single obvious thing, just in the air itself. I was assigned to the west corridor that morning. Window cleaning. It was solitary work, the kind I usually didn't mind. Just me and a squeegee, and the gray morning light coming through tall glass panels. I worked from the far end inward, methodically, the way Donna had shown me in the first week. I was on the third window when I heard footsteps approaching from the east end of the corridor. Unhurried, evenly spaced. I knew before I turned that it was him. He was alone, which was unusual. Hakjin walked with his hands behind his back, looking at something on the floor ahead of him, or maybe at nothing in particular. It was hard to tell with him. He was wearing dark trousers and a plain charcoal sweater, no jacket, no suit. It was the most casual I had ever seen him, and it made him look, for just a fraction of a second, like someone almost ordinary. Then he looked up, and the fraction of a second passed. I turned back to the window and kept working. He stopped a few feet away from me. I could see his reflection faintly in the glass, a dark shape against the pale corridor behind him. He didn't say anything immediately, and I didn't turn around. I kept the squeegee moving in long, even strokes the way I was supposed to. "How long have you been here?" he asked. His English was precise and lightly accented, every word placed with care. I had heard him speak before, but always at a distance, always as part of a larger scene. This was different. This was directed at me, in an empty corridor, with no Donna nearby and no other staff in sight. "Almost 4 weeks," I said. I kept my voice even, professional. "Do you find the work manageable?" I paused for just a half second before answering. "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. In the glass reflection, I could see that he hadn't moved. "Last night," he said. "The man at the end of the table. He didn't bother you?" There it was. The thing I had been turning over in my mind since the night before, now sitting directly in the air between us, waiting for me to do something with it. "No," I said carefully. He asked about the wine selection. That's not what he did. I stopped moving the squeegee. My hand stayed on the handle, but the motion stopped, and for a moment the corridor was completely silent, except for the faint sound of wind against the glass on the other side. I didn't know what to say to that. I didn't know what he wanted me to say. So I said nothing, which felt like the safest choice, and also felt like its own kind of admission. "You may continue," he said, and he walked away. I stood at that window for a few seconds after his footsteps faded, looking at my own reflection in the glass, my expression carefully neutral, the way I had trained it to be in this house. But my eyes doing something I couldn't quite control, something that looked too much like unease, wrapped around a question I wasn't ready to ask out loud. The following days moved at a strange pace. Not slow exactly, but textured differently, like there was more in each hour than there used to be. I did my work. I followed the schedule. I ate in the staff kitchen with Donna and the others, listened to their conversations about shift rotations and grocery orders and the weather, contributed when it felt natural, and stayed quiet when it didn't. On the surface, nothing had changed. But I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way the security team's positioning shifted slightly whenever I moved between the main floors. How one of the men, a younger one, always stationed near the East Wing stairs, would turn his head in my direction for just a moment when I crossed his line of sight. How a door that had previously been left open in the mornings was now closed, and when I went to open it to clean the room inside, it was unlocked but the light was already on, as if someone had been in there recently and left in a hurry. Small things, possibly meaningless, except that in a house where everything was deliberate, nothing was meaningless. I mentioned it to no one. There was no one to mention it to. My roommates were pleasant enough, but we kept to our own corners, each of us managing our own private version of whatever it was that had brought us here. My cousin hadn't called in 2 weeks. My mother was in Atlanta and thought I worked for a private household management company, which was technically not wrong. On Wednesday evening, Donna handed me a revised schedule for the following week. I looked it over at the kitchen table after dinner. Most of it was the same. But Thursday afternoon had been changed. Instead of the West Wing, my assignment read, Private Library, Inventory Check, Dust, General Maintenance. The private library was on the second floor, adjacent to the office. I read the line twice. Then I looked up at Donna, who was writing something at her desk on the other side of the room, her back to me. I looked back down at the schedule. Maybe it was nothing. Libraries needed cleaning same as anywhere else. But the timing of it, right after what had happened in the corridor, right after what he'd said at the dining room door, sat with me in a way that ordinary scheduling didn't. Thursday arrived with a heavy, still quality to the air, the kind that settles over New York in late autumn, when the cold hasn't fully committed yet. I went to the private library at 2 p.m, with a small cart of supplies, dusting cloths, wood conditioner, a clipboard for the inventory sheet Donna had prepared. The library was smaller than the main sitting rooms, but felt more enclosed, more personal. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, a reading table in the center, a single armchair near the window with a lamp beside it, angled just right for reading. The books were organized with a precision that was clearly intentional. Not decorative, not random, actually organized by someone who used them. I started at the far left shelf and worked my way along. I was supposed to note any damaged spines, any books that had been removed from sequence, any gaps in the existing arrangement. I moved carefully, not wanting to disturb the order of anything. I was near the middle of the second wall when the door opened. I turned around with the clipboard in my hand, expecting Donna, or maybe Marcus doing a routine check. It was Hakjin. He paused when he saw me, just briefly, a fraction of a second, and I realized he hadn't expected me to be here either. Or perhaps he had expected it, and the pause was something else entirely. With him, it was genuinely difficult to know. "I can come back," I said immediately. "No." He stepped inside and let the door close behind him. "Finish what you're doing." He went to the reading table, picked up a folder that had been sitting there, and stood looking through it. I turned back to the shelves and kept going with the inventory, my handwriting slightly less steady than usual on the clipboard sheet. For a few minutes, the only sounds in the room were the soft movement of pages and the quiet scratch of my pencil. "Your cousin arranged your placement here," he said, without looking up from the folder. My hand stopped on the clipboard. "Yes," I said. "Her name is Diana." It wasn't a question. He already knew. Of course he already knew. Donna would have the full employment records, and in this household, the employer would have reviewed them personally. Still, hearing my cousin's name said aloud in this room by this man made something in my chest pull tight in a way I hadn't anticipated. "Yes," I said again. "She did you a favor," he said, "and herself one at the same time." I didn't respond to that. I wasn't sure I was supposed to. There was something underneath those words that I sensed was important, but I couldn't see the full shape of it, only the edges, and reaching for something when you can only see the edges is how you cut yourself. He closed the folder and set it back on the table. "The inventory sheet," he said. "Leave it with Donna when you finish." "Of course." He walked to the door, opened it, then stopped, one hand on the frame, his back still to me. "Isabella. My name again, same as before. Quiet, precise. Be careful about which rooms you enter alone." He left before I could decide if that was a warning or something else. I stood in the middle of that library for a long moment, surrounded by shelves of organized books and the faint smell of wood polish, holding a clipboard with several lines left blank, trying to determine what exactly had just been placed in my hands, and whether holding it was safe. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because anything dramatic had happened. Nothing had. Not really. A conversation in a library. A sentence left open at both ends. A door closing behind a man who had said my name twice in a week, and both times made it sound like something that carried more weight than a name should reasonably carry. I lay on my side in the dark, listening to the sound of my roommate Maya's steady breathing from across the room, and thought about what he had said. Be careful about which rooms you enter alone. I had turned it over so many times by now that the words had started to lose their shape. The way a word does when you repeat it too many times, and it stops sounding like language, and starts sounding like something else entirely. Was it a warning about him? About someone else in the house? About the guests who came and went through those side doors late at night, whose names I never knew, and whose faces I tried not to look at directly? I didn't have an answer. What I had instead was the uncomfortable awareness that I was spending significant mental energy on a man I worked for, which was a habit I could not afford to develop. So I made myself stop. I closed my eyes, slowed my breathing deliberately, and waited for sleep to arrive. It took a long time. The next morning, something happened that made everything else feel smaller by comparison. I was in the kitchen just after 7, finishing my coffee before the shift properly began, when Marcus appeared in the doorway. He looked at me with a directness that was different from his usual manner, more focused, the kind of look that precedes information you aren't going to enjoy receiving. Someone tried to access the east gate last night, he said, after midnight. Used a staff code. I set down my cup. What code? He looked at me steadily. Yours. The kitchen felt very still. The ventilation hummed. Someone in the back was washing something at the sink, the water running loud and then quiet. I didn't leave my room last night, I said. I know. His tone was flat, but not unkind. The camera logs confirm it. You were on the 3rd floor from 9:43 p.m. until this morning. But someone had your access code, and they tried to use it at the east gate at 12:17 a.m. I felt a cold, specific kind of discomfort move through me. Not quite fear, but the precursor to it. The shape of something I didn't want to look at directly. How would someone have my code? I asked. That, Marcus said, is what we're trying to determine. He left after that, giving me nothing else. I stood in the kitchen for a moment after he went, my coffee cooling on the counter, my mind moving through the past 4 weeks with a new and unwelcome lens. Who had been close enough, consistently enough, to see me enter my code at the gate? We used it to come in through the side entrance on days off. I had used mine 3 times. Each time I had been alone, or thought I had been. I went to find Donna. She was already aware. She knew everything that happened in that house before most people did, which was either reassuring or unsettling depending on the moment. She sat me down in her narrow office and asked me, calmly and methodically, to walk her through every time I had used the gate code. I did. She wrote things down. She didn't tell me what she thought. She thanked me and said I should continue my regular schedule and not discuss this with the other staff. I nodded and went to do exactly that. But the rest of the morning was difficult to get through. My hands kept doing the work, folding, lifting, arranging, while my brain sat behind my eyes running its own separate operations, trying to figure out who in a house full of careful, quiet, professional people had been watching me carefully enough to take something as small as a 6-digit access code. At noon, I was called to Donna's office again. This time, Hakjin was there. He was standing near the small window, one shoulder against the wall, arms crossed loosely. He wasn't looking at the window. He was looking at the door when I walked in, as if he had been waiting for precisely the moment I arrived. Donna was at her desk, pen in hand, not writing anything. I stopped just inside the door. "Sit down," Donna said. I sat in the chair across from her desk. My back was straight without me having to think about it. Some situations instinctively remove the option to slouch. "We've identified whose code was used to attempt the gate entry," Donna said. "We're addressing it. But the reason you're here is because the situation has implications for your security within the household. I looked at her. Then, despite myself, I looked at him. Hakjin was watching me with that same steady attention he always carried, and I still could not read it precisely. Not cold, not warm. Something more functional than either of those things. Like the attention of someone solving a problem that requires all available information before a decision can be made. What kind of implications? I asked. Donna glanced toward Hakjin briefly before answering, which told me the answer had been discussed before I entered the room. Your current room assignment puts you in a shared space on the 3rd floor, she said. Given what happened, Mr. Hakjin believes it would be more appropriate to move you to the East Wing. I sat with that for a second. The East Wing was the 2nd floor. Private, smaller rooms, 1 per person, reserved for senior staff. I had never even been inside that corridor outside of work hours. That's not necessary, I said. I'm fine where I am. It's not a question, Hakjin said. His voice was quiet, completely calm. 2 words, and the conversation was over on that particular point. I looked at the floor for a moment. There was a very specific quality to not having a choice inside a situation that was presented as consideration for your welfare, and it sat with me in a place I couldn't immediately name. Not anger, not exactly. Something more complicated. When? I asked. This afternoon, Donna said. After your shift. I moved my things at 5:30. It didn't take long. I hadn't accumulated much in 4 weeks. 2 changes of uniform, my personal clothes folded into the same bag I had arrived with, my phone charger, the small framed photograph of my mother I kept on the nightstand. Maya watched me pack without asking questions, which I appreciated more than I could have explained. The room in the East Wing was small, but entirely my own. A single bed, a window that faced the rear garden, a wardrobe, a desk. There was a small bathroom adjacent that I would share with only one other person, senior staff on the other side. The floor was quiet. The walls felt thicker somehow, the outside sounds more muffled. I sat on the edge of the new bed and looked around the room. It was nicer than where I had been. Quieter, more private, genuinely more comfortable. And that fact bothered me in a way that a less comfortable arrangement might not have, because it was easier to maintain a clear sense of your own situation when nothing about it felt like something you might choose for yourself. Someone knocked on the open door. I looked up. It was Marcus. There's a new access code for your gate entry, he said, handing me a folded piece of paper. Different sequence, only yours. Don't write it anywhere. Understood, I said. He left. I unfolded the paper, looked at the 6 digits, then folded it back up and held it in my hand. The house was very quiet around me. Downstairs somewhere, the muffled cadence of what sounded like a phone call in another language reached up through the floor and dissolved before it arrived fully formed. The rear garden outside my window was dark, just the faint shape of the hedgerows visible against the night sky. I thought about calling my cousin. I thought about it seriously, sitting there on that bed with my unopened bag beside me, for a solid 3 minutes. I wanted to ask her what exactly she had gotten me into, what the other side of the favor she had done herself actually looked like, and whether she had known before she made the call to me that this particular household was not a place you left simply because your contract ended. But I didn't call her. Because some part of me, quiet and uncomfortable, and not quite honest with itself yet, was not entirely sure that leaving was what I wanted. That thought frightened me more than the gate incident had. I put my phone face down on the desk, unpacked my bag with deliberate, methodical movements, and went to bed at 9 o'clock. Outside, somewhere on the ground floor, I heard a door close. Firm and final, the way only one person in that house closed doors. I pulled the blanket up and stared at the ceiling until my eyes finally gave out. 3 days passed without anything remarkable happening. which in that house felt more suspicious than reassuring. I did my work. I learned the East Wing's rhythms, which floorboards creaked, how the heating ticked on at 6 a.m. and again at 9 p.m., the exact angle of morning light that came through my window and moved across the desk by 8:30. Small things, the kind of details you absorb when a place starts to feel less temporary, which was itself a detail I tried not to think about too directly. On the 4th day, Donna told me that the staff member whose negligence had exposed my access code had been dismissed. She said it in the same tone she used to announce schedule changes. Straightforward, no drama, already resolved. She didn't tell me who it was. I didn't ask. In this house, asking for details about things that had already been handled was the kind of habit that served no one. I said thank you and went back to work. But that afternoon, something happened that none of the previous weeks had prepared me for. I was in the East Wing corridor, returning my supply cart to the storage room at the far end, when I heard voices coming from behind the closed door of the room adjacent to mine. Not raised voices. Nothing in that house was raised, but urgent. The way a conversation sounds when the people having it are choosing their words under pressure. I couldn't make out what was being said. I wasn't trying to. I moved my cart past the door without slowing down, eyes forward, the way Donna had trained me. But as I passed, the door opened. A man I had never seen before stepped out into the corridor. He was older than Hawk Jean, with a thick build and the kind of face that had been arranged by decades of knowing exactly how much power it represented. He looked at me with a flat, assessing expression, the kind that takes inventory without interest. Behind him, Hawk Jean appeared in the doorway. He looked at the man, then at me. Something moved through his expression so quickly, I almost missed it. Not alarm, not quite, but something adjacent to it, gone before it fully arrived. Back to the storage room, Hawk Jean said, and it took me a full second to realize he was speaking to me. I turned and kept walking with the cart. Behind me, I heard him speak to the other man in Korean, low and controlled, the conversation resuming as the door closed again. In the storage room, I stood with both hands on the cart handle and waited for my pulse to settle. There had been something in the way he looked at me when that door opened, something that was not about work, not about schedules or access codes or which corridor I should be cleaning, something that I couldn't name without stepping into territory I had been carefully avoiding for the past several weeks. I let go of the cart handle and started putting supplies away, one item at a time, methodical and deliberate, the way you do things when your hands need something to do so your mind doesn't get too much space. That evening, just before 8, Marcus knocked on my room door. "Mr. Hawk Jean wants to see you," he said. "His office." I looked at him for a moment. Now. I followed Marcus downstairs in silence. The house was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that gathers in the hours after dinner when the day's business is technically finished, but hasn't fully let go. The office door was closed. Marcus knocked once, opened it, and stepped aside for me to enter. Hawk Jean was behind his desk. No folder this time, no open laptop. He was simply sitting, one hand resting on the desk surface. And when I came in, he looked at me directly without the usual beat of evaluation first. "Close the door," he said. I did. I stood on the opposite side of the desk and waited. "The man you saw in the corridor today," he said, "his name doesn't matter. What matters is that he asked about you." The room was very still. "About me," I repeated. "He noticed you at the Friday dinner. He made a specific inquiry this afternoon about your position in this household." Hawk Jean's voice was even, almost clinical in its delivery, except for something underneath it that pulled slightly tighter on certain words. "I told him you were not available for any inquiry." I wasn't entirely sure what available meant in that context, and I was fairly certain that not knowing was the safer condition to remain in. "What did he say to that?" I asked. Hakjin looked at me for a long moment. He said that everything in this house had a price. The silence after that sentence was its own kind of statement. And what did you say? My voice was steadier than I expected it to be. Something changed in his expression. Not much. Just a fraction, the way the surface of water changes when something moves beneath it without breaking through. I said he was correct, Hakjin said, and that the price of certain things was not one he could meet. I stood very still. The office felt smaller than it had during previous visits, the walls more present, the air more concentrated somehow. Outside the curtained window, a car engine turned over in the distance and then faded. I'm telling you this, he continued, because you have a right to understand your situation clearly, and because I want you to know that what happened at the gate last week and what happened in that corridor today are not unrelated. Something clicked into place in my mind, slow and heavy, like a bolt sliding home. Someone was watching me, I said. Not a question. Someone communicated information about you to people outside this house, he said. That has been addressed, but the interest those people have doesn't disappear because the source does. I looked at the desk surface for a moment, the grain of the dark wood, the precise edge where Hakjin's hand rested, still and unhurried. What does that mean for me? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. That pause, the way he used silence as punctuation, was something I had grown familiar with. It meant he was not choosing whether to answer, but how. It means, he said, that your position here is different from what it was when you arrived. Different how? He looked at me steadily. You're not invisible anymore, Isabella. Not to the people outside this house. Which means the way this household treats your presence here needs to reflect that. I thought about Diana, about the phone call I still hadn't made, about my mother in Atlanta who thought I worked for a management company. I thought about the 6-digit code on the folded piece of paper in my desk drawer, about the East Wing room that was quieter than anywhere I had lived in years, about the way a single look across a dinner table had made a grown man put down whatever he was thinking. You're telling me I can't leave, I said quietly. I'm telling you, he said, with the same careful precision he put into everything, that leaving right now would be unsafe. That is not the same thing. It was a distinction, a real one probably, but sitting inside it, in that office, at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, it felt remarkably similar from the inside. For how long? I asked. Until it's resolved. And who decides when it's resolved? He held my gaze without any discomfort at all. I do. I left the office 10 minutes later with nothing changed on the surface and everything changed underneath. Marcus wasn't in the hallway. I walked back to the East Wing stairs alone, which had not happened before. There was usually someone nearby, not obviously following, just present. The absence of it now felt deliberate. A small offering of space after a conversation that had taken a great deal of it away. I went to my room, sat at the desk, looked at the window, at the dark garden beyond it, at my own faint reflection in the glass. I thought about what he had said, about the difference between can't leave and unsafe to leave. I turned it over the way I had turned over his other sentences, looking for the place where control ended and genuine concern began, trying to locate the line between the two. In that house, with that man, the line was not always visible. Maybe it wasn't always meant to be. But here was the thing I kept arriving at, no matter which direction I approached it from. And this was the part I was least comfortable admitting, even to myself, in the privacy of my own room at night. I believed him. Not completely, not without reservation, not in the uncomplicated way that belief usually works, but in the specific limited way that you believe someone when their actions have consistently matched their words over enough time for a pattern to become recognizable. He had not lied to me once in the weeks I had been here. He had said very little, but what he had said had been true. That was not nothing. In the situation I was in, that was actually quite a lot. I reached over and turned on the desk lamp, pulled a piece of paper from the small notepad I kept in the drawer, wrote my mother's number at the top, then Diana's below it, then sat looking at both of them. I didn't reach for my phone. Instead, I folded the paper carefully, the same way I had folded the paper with the gate code, and put it in the drawer. Outside, the garden was dark and still. Somewhere in the house below me, I could hear the faint sound of movement. Someone crossing a room, a door opening and settling closed. The ordinary sounds of a place that was still operating, still functional, still intact around whatever it was that had shifted in the last few days. I turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark for a while. I was not the same person who had carried a bag up to a third-floor room 4 weeks ago, not sure how long she'd last, counting the weeks until she had enough to leave. That version of myself felt like someone I had read about rather than been. The woman sitting in this East Wing room, in the dark, turning over sentences and looking for lines between things. She knew more, saw more, understood at minimum that the walls of her situation were more intricate than they had first appeared. That could have been frightening, and parts of it were. But underneath the fear, quieter and more stubborn, was something that felt almost like clarity. The kind that arrives not when everything is safe, but when you finally stop pretending that you don't understand exactly where you are. I was in Huck Jean's house, under his protection, by his decision, on his terms. And for reasons I wasn't fully ready to put into words, I had stopped counting the weeks until I could leave.